and welcome to another edition of our webinar on ideas, interests, institutions, and nation-state climate politics. Today, we are talking about the global adaptation regime, building resilience for an uncertain future. We are very pleased to have colleagues with us from around the Northern Hemisphere today. First, we're going to have a presentation by Thomas Oatley of Tulane University, where he's the Khorasaniti Zondorak Chair of International Relations. And then we're going to have two discussants. We have Jacob Skovgaard, who's an associate professor of political science at Lund University. And then we have Jonas Naum, who's an assistant professor of energy, resources, and environment at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies right here in Washington. So what we're going to do is start the presentation and ask you to please collect any questions you may have and put them in the Q&A area so that at the end of this discussion, we can take some questions from our viewers. Thank you so much for joining us. And I turn the floor over to Professor Oatley. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Todd. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today, and thank everyone for devoting a small portion of their day today to come and listen to us talk about adaptation. So what I want to do is essentially provide what I guess we might think of as a broad foundation for further conversation by looking at adaptation in the context of the Paris climate change regime through the lens of this interests, institutions, and ideas framework. And so how I want to spend my time then is thinking about kind of the 5 components of this. First, kind of lay out a little bit of the history of the process, talk about how Paris essentially codified, embraced developments that had occurred previously, and then from that foundation, look at the 3 components of the theoretical foundation, the ideational foundations, institutions, and those 2 components to really help us understand how the adaptation pillar of the Paris regime is structured. And then third, I will talk about interests and think a little bit, help us think a little bit about how the parties engaged in negotiating this pillar of adaptation perceived the issue, had different interests across the issue, as well as now that adaptation is in Paris, have different conceptions of how to move forward with this. And then I will conclude briefly drawing what I see to be 2 major implications from the regime and pointing to what I see as 2 challenges ahead. All right. Maybe the place to start then is with some basic definitions. What do we mean by adaptation? And particularly, what do we mean by adaptation in the context of the climate change regime? And so for this, it's useful to motivate the discussion with definitions drawn from authoritative entities. And so the first definition here, the ability of systems, institutions, humans, and other organisms to adjust to potential damage, to take advantage of opportunities, or to respond to consequences of climate change. That comes from the IPCC. The UNFCCC offers a definition that is quite similar in nature, perhaps a little bit more extensive. They define adaptation as adjustments in ecological, social, or economic systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli and their effects or impacts. Adaptation refers to changes in processes, practices, and structures to moderate potential damages or to benefit from opportunities associated with climate change. And so fundamentally what we're talking about here is thinking about how do we change existing systems in recognition of the impacts that climate change will have on the societies, culture, institutions, and so forth. Now, for most of the history of the climate change regime, adaptation was kind of a marginal concern for, I guess, perhaps the best way to say this, a marginal concern for the great powers. So if you look at the UNFCCC, there's nothing in it as it emerged in 1992 that references adaptation specifically. The Kyoto Protocol really pushes adaptation to kind of the back burner as a separate issue. It's an issue that's quite subordinate to concerns about mitigation. And I'll talk more about the reasons for that when I talk about interests. And so really for the first 14 years or so of the climate change regime, kind of from 1988 through 1992, and then on through the negotiation of the Kyoto Protocol and into the early years post-Kyoto Protocol, adaptation was pushed to the side. It's really in the early 21st century that adaptation comes to or begins to come to the center of, I guess, COP processes and negotiations in the regime. And the first, I would say, definitive step or important step here comes in 2001 at COP7 with Marrakesh, where you get some initial efforts to create financial mechanisms. I'll talk more about those later. Established a National Adaptation Program of Action, an LDC expert group, and all of these were steps taken to kind of put adaptation on a firmer kind of institutional foundation within the regime and create an initial structure upon which to build. So 2007, a second step comes with the Bali Action Plan, and this pushed adaptation up alongside mitigation, technology transfer and finance as a critical component of the regime, or at least as an ambition. 2009 in Copenhagen, industrial countries pledged $30 billion in fast start finance, a significant portion of which, although exactly how much was unclear, was to be dedicated to adaptation projects. They committed $100 billion per year, ramping up to that by 2020. Again, a significant portion of that would be targeted at adaptation and joint adaptation mitigation projects. They also created the Green Climate Fund, which would address adaptation, joint adaptation mitigation, as well as mitigation projects moving forward. 2010, you get another step coming in Cancun, creating additional structures, the Adaptation Committee, the Standing Committee on Finance, shifting from the NAPAs to the National Adaptation Plans, work program on loss and damage, and an initial agreement that adaptation would be brought into and made a central pillar of the next subsequent to Kyoto Protocol agreement. And so finally, 2015, you have the Paris Agreement codifying and providing legal status for adaptation as an independent pillar of the regime, and in theory, placing adaptation, therefore, in equal standing to mitigation, finance, and technology transfer. So if you take a look at what the Paris Agreement says, you see the reference to adaptation appearing in Article 7, 7.1, parties hereby establish the global goal on adaptation, enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, reducing vulnerability to climate change, and so forth. And that then is followed in Article 7.2, where parties recognize that adaptation is a global challenge faced by all, which is kind of an important note there, that the global nature of this challenge, a point I'll come back to. So global challenge faced by all, and having a local, a subnational, a national, a regional, and an international dimension. And that it is a key component of and makes a contribution to the long-term global response to climate change, and so forth. And so really an effort to put adaptation in the Paris Agreement on a standing that is, or gives it importance, weight, and perhaps legal authority, although there's some disagreement about that, to the same degree that mitigation has legal authority and status. Okay. Now, if we look at the characteristics of the adaptation regime, we can look at the ideational foundations of the regime, the institutional elements, and the interests. And so I want to start with the ideational foundations. And as I see it, there are really four core ideational components to the regime. Adaptation is a local challenge. I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail. Adaptation is multidimensional. Third is a commitment to adapt in place. And then the fourth is this idea of mainstreaming adaptation. So if we want to look at each of these four in a little bit more detail, adaptation is local, really means that in spite of the broader commitment to adaptation as a globally significant phenomenon, I think in the regime itself, one sees a continuing belief, adherence to the idea that adaptation is fundamentally a local phenomenon. And so here's a nice quote from the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC: climate change is global, while adaptation is local. And based on what I have read to date, I'd be very interested in getting kind of responses from Jakob and Jonas today. There seem to be two meanings to local. One is that the impacts of climate change are going to manifest locally. Obviously, if we're going to talk about the impact of a changing climate, it's going to hit some territorial space, some geography, and that is necessarily going to be local in nature. That often these local impacts would be quite unique, and as a consequence, the local authorities, however we want to define them, were best situated to evaluate and respond to the challenges. And so this is really a local in the sense that climate change impacts will happen in specific locations, and people who inhabit those locations are best suited to figure out how to deal with them. And not be best endowed with the resources necessary to respond to them, but they have the best local knowledge to enable them to do so. And then the second notion of local is a little bit, kind of picks up on the notion of Christiana Figueres' quote, which is that it's really low-income countries, developing societies, who were most exposed to and at risk of climate change impacts, while high-income states would be much less significantly exposed. And to a large extent, that differential exposure or differential vulnerability, I think, is a function of different economic structures, different socioeconomic structures, wherein low-income societies are still heavily dependent upon agriculture and other primary commodity economic activities. And thus, those activities are much more sensitive to a changing climate than industry and knowledge economy activities in the high-income states. And so rather than thinking of this adaptation as a common global problem, the belief seems to have been that adaptation was largely a local concern for a subset of countries or parties to the climate change regime. I think the second concern has changed or been moderated a bit, but we will talk a little bit about that also, I hope, during the Q&A session. And I will note that this commitment to the local nature of adaptation exists in some tension with Paris Article 7.2, right, which really talks about the global nature of the adaptation challenge. And I think this is a tension that persists across the system. So that's the first idea. The second idea that is at the foundation of the regime or pillar is that adaptation is multidimensional. And what this means is that adaptation is not simply a matter of identifying geophysical vulnerabilities and taking steps to protect geography and physical infrastructure, the built environment, from climate change impacts, but also a matter of identifying sociocultural vulnerabilities and taking steps to defend or protect sociocultural communities from likely climate change impacts. And one sees this multidimensional nature of adaptation, in particular the addition of the sociocultural component in the Paris Agreement preamble, right, which notes this broad concern for human rights, commitment to climate justice, respect to health, rights of indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, and so forth. And so here we see the notion that in responding to adaptation, what we wish to do is really two things, two practical manifestations here: a logic of protection, where we want to protect not just the physical space, the physical environment, but also the communities who live there, in order to protect existing communities, indigenous people, and so forth. And the other manifestation of the multidimensional nature of this, which kind of also taps into the notion of adaptation as local, is a logic of inclusion, wherein in designing solutions or responses to anticipated climate impacts, states are encouraged to incorporate or include non-state actors, community officials, and everyone who is a stakeholder in the communities likely to be affected in designing and implementing the solutions that are developed. And so I think that adaptation is multidimensional, also kind of reinforces the notion of adaptation being a local phenomenon. So that's the second ideational foundation. The third is adapt in place. And here the logic is, rather than moving people to get them out of harm's way, we're essentially going to try to develop means and mechanisms that allow communities to withstand, become more resilient to the climate change impacts that they're likely to confront. And so we're going to encourage societies to seek adaptive solutions that enable people to experience minimal disruption to life in their communities, subject to the severity and nature of the climate challenge they confront. And this seems to have two dimensions. One is very much a kind of a hardscape, and the other is more of a software. And so on the one hand, we're going to build infrastructure to protect communities from severe weather, from inundation, from coastal erosion, and so forth. And so you can think of this as kind of a hardening. And then the second dimension is we're going to deploy agricultural techniques and technologies that are better suited to the emerging conditions that we're likely to experience. And while I emphasize agriculture here, I think this is also true for other kinds of activities, fishing, and so forth. So that's the third big idea that underlies the pillar. And then the fourth is mainstreaming. And the mainstreaming is the recognition that rather than treat adaptation as a fundamentally separate, siloed challenge to which the global community and local officials will respond, policymakers will try to bring climate change adaptation into the development planning, sectoral decision-making, and regular budget processes as an integrated and holistic component of these ongoing processes. And the idea here is rather than develop or engage in development planning, develop specific projects only then to have to go back in time and retrofit them for adaptation purposes makes little sense. And so why not try to blend those two processes into one so that we can develop plans for structural change that are cognizant of, aware of, and try to address adaptation from the beginning. I would say that this mainstreaming is somewhat controversial for reasons I'll talk about when we talk about interests. But I'd point out that there's a little bit of tension between this notion of mainstreaming and adapted place, for instance, and locality. So to the extent that we think about development as really efforts to bring about structural change, then mainstreaming, bringing adaptation into development planning creates a little bit of tension with the broader commitments to adapt in place and local. And I think also, although I'm less comfortable or confident in this last point, I think that mainstreaming tends to bring adaptation into an established development process, and therefore bends the adaptation dynamics to the needs or demands of development, rather than trying to bend development to the realities of climate change impacts, and vulnerabilities. So those are the four ideas that I think are underpinning this pillar of adaptation. So we can transition from there then to look at institutions. And as I see it, there are really three components to the institutions: a planning stage, a project finance stage, excuse me, and a stock taking stage. Planning stage is really about encouraging low-income societies to think hard about the vulnerabilities they face, both geophysical and sociocultural, and in conjunction with local stakeholders, determine how best to address these vulnerabilities in ways that are consistent with, subject to mainstreaming, broader development projects. And so this planning program really begins, was established in Marrakesh COP in 2001 under this National Adaptation Program of Action, where there was an effort to get developing countries to begin thinking about climate change impacts and the need for adaptation in a world in which they hadn't really done much along those lines to that point. And so this created a process, 8-step process, really tied the submission of a NAPA to your eligibility for financial support from the Least Developed Countries Fund, really as a way of kind of supercharging some initial adaptation planning. This NAPA then gives way to a second initiative called National Action Plans that really are launched in Cancun in 2010. And these are both more ambitious and at the same time less conditional, I think, in that low-income societies are encouraged again to identify medium and long-term adaptation needs, working in conjunction with community stakeholders, get them to think about how to develop projects and programs that will reduce their vulnerability or enhance their resilience to the challenges they faced. And in contrast to the NAPAs, here the initiative of the NAPs was intended to encourage developing societies to engage in new research, to look a bit more systematically at the challenges they faced and to go beyond what they already knew. And this process was put in place 2010, really persisted through 2017 or so. You get 34 states completing a NAP, 129, 154 undertaking at least one activity. And then from what I understand, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, the NAP process seems to have been folded into or taken over by planning in the context of the nationally determined contributions. And so there is now an effort on the part of the NDCs to include a large adaptation component. And one sees this in the run-up to the Glasgow COP last year. The UNFCCC published this synthesis 48 that looked at 48 NDCs from 75 parties and evaluated their various components. And they saw that focus on adaptation was growing and talked a lot about how the focus on adaptation was tied to other initiatives, and then also tying adaptation to specific concerns, food security and production, terrestrial and wetland ecosystems, freshwater resources, etc. All right, and so first element there, thus, of the institutional framework is planning. Second element is the finance. And so here we have the 4 core financial mechanisms created as a consequence of this 2001 through Paris process: Least Developed Countries Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, and the Green Climate Fund. Talk a little bit more in the conclusion about the Adaptation Fund gap, which is quite significant. So a little bit here about the amount of money provided for adaptation processes and planning through each of these. I think moving forward, it's the Green Climate Fund as a multilateral body that's going to be carrying most of the weight, and the Green Climate Fund has this 50-50 split in allocating funds to mitigation and adaptation, So it has some projects that are entirely mitigation, some that are entirely adaptation, and some that are joint. Okay. So that's the second component, a series of dedicated financial institutions. This gives you a sense of where projects are targeted in terms of functional category. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. The third component then is stock taking. Not surprising, we have planning, developing projects, we have financing of projects, then we have a stock taking or an evaluation stage. And the stock taking stage here is runs parallel with stock taking on NDCs and mitigation. It's supposed to start in 2023. It's a bit more challenging for adaptation to review, evaluate, and take stock than it is for mitigation because there are much greater problems or much less clarity in establishing benchmarks and thinking about what adaptation means, thinking about how to evaluate the extent to which a particular intervention has an adaptive impact or not. And so it seems that a lot of the discussion at the present is thinking about how to design a stock taking for adaptation that is consistent across countries and can be consistent across time as well. So those are the three elements of the institutional component. And then finally, we come to interests. And the interest here probably isn't all that much of a surprise. The interest divide here parallels the cleavages we see in mitigation negotiations. We have the net climate forcing states, big emitters versus the climate vulnerable states, lower income societies. The small island developing states are a highly prominent group, played a large role in pushing adaptation onto the negotiating agenda in the early 2000s. The reason why, or the reason adaptation was pushed off the agenda in the 1990s had a lot to do with the interests of the net climate forcing states to focus on mitigation. Partly this reflected their belief that adaptation was local in nature. So there are very few global public goods to be realized from supporting adaptation. Second, there was a belief that the more effort was made along adaptation, the less pressure there would be to mitigate. And so adaptation got this reputation for being kind of taboo or the dirty word. And then I think in addition, discussion of adaptation was in the climate forcing states viewed as an implicit acceptance of responsibility for climate change, could have issues associated with liability and compensation, which the large emitters did not wish to embrace. And so those concerns, I think, began to change from what I understand as progress on mitigation lagged. Carbon forcing states accepted adaptation as necessary. And based on here, Todd's comments on this as well, about the separation of loss and damage from adaptation, which reduced some of the, I think, some of the concerns about liability and compensation that made it easier for developed societies, the climate forcing states, to accept adaptation. Okay. Moving forward, current differences seem to revolve around how much financing, revolve around mainstreaming, principle of additivity, and I'll talk more about that in a second, as well as the extent and nature of liability and obligation. Okay. So in conclusion, I think what one sees is a dramatic change in the way adaptation is treated at the global level, from being an afterthought and off the agenda to being a central part of the Paris Agreement, one of the major pillars in the agreement. And I think what that implies is that the climate vulnerable states have won on principle, but when one looks at the structure of the system itself, the ideas, the institutions, and the interests, it seems to me that the climate forcing states have really prevailed on practice. The system is very hierarchical. Funding is contributed by and controlled by the net emitters, and there are strong parallels to the economic development regime that run throughout. And so victory on principle, less so on practice. Challenges moving ahead, as I see it, are twofold. One is the funding gap. Funding for adaptation increased by 53% between 2017 and 2020, according to the Climate Policy Initiative. But the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report notes that the the costs annually of adaptation are an order of magnitude greater than the amount we are spending on adaptation today. And there's no indication that those funds are forthcoming with any degree of urgency. So that's one challenge. How do we bridge this gap? The second challenge is kind of some of the ideational foundations, in particular the commitment to adapt in place. It seems here this omits and fails to take into account questions about migration, both internal and international. It seems that migration is, according to a large body of literature, an adaptation strategy for households and for populations. And so it would be useful to begin to think about, in the context of a global regime, what kinds of migration we're likely to see, how to plan for these movements in order to, I guess, protect the people who are affected as we move forward. Okay, so with that, I will stop and turn this back to Todd and look forward to comments from everyone. Thank you.
Many thanks, Thomas, for a very wide-ranging and comprehensive, but interesting presentation in the sense of sort of highlighting changes in the evolution of thoughts about adaptation, which is really important and perhaps not so often considered. So thank you. And we would turn now to Jacob to offer an initial round of comments, and then we'll go to Jonas, and then we'll open up the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you, Thomas, for a very interesting presentation and also an interesting paper. I think it's very nice where you sketched the history of adaptation and how, perhaps contrary to expectations, it became a central part of the UNFCCC. I have different sets of questions. I'm not an adaptation expert. I've been working on climate finance to some degree, and that perhaps colors a bit how I view your presentation and how I view adaptation in general. First of all, I wonder, within the context of the wider UNFCCC regime, to what degree there is a kind of relationship between the change from the very top-down mitigation regime you had in the Kyoto. It was completely top-down, but still it was quite based on the idea of mitigation being a global public good. You needed to have globally set targets. You need to have different kinds of monitoring mechanisms, to the more bottom-up system you have in the Paris Agreement. And I think, in a way, the story you tell fits nicely into this. It becomes more about, because on the national level, it's not just about addressing one singular global public good. It's a more multifaceted problem. So I think that's a context where your story fits well into that. I also thought, in terms of the wider UNFCCC negotiations, I think that the history is quite interesting because it arguably reveals a lot about the power dynamics within the UNFCCC. Because, as you said in your conclusion, a lot of the kind of the top line big agreements, there the vulnerable countries have a fair deal of influence. When it comes to implementation, to delivery of funds particularly, they have less influence. And my kind of nasty feeling is that it may have something to do with, when you have the big COPs in Paris and Copenhagen, then there's a lot of pressure on the climate forcing countries, on the large emitters, especially the so-called industrialized countries, both from the least developed countries, and the need to have them on board so they don't block agreements, but also from domestic NGOs, domestic publics, who can shame them for not being willing to deliver funding for adaptation. But when the attention draws away and there's no big agreement that's needed, then it's much easier not to deliver the finance that's been promised, which I think is an important part of the story, as you also said in your conclusion. Then a kind of slightly different take on this is the question of, maybe what is adaptation? Because I'm not an adaptation expert, and I often wonder what exactly is adaptation, and in this context, what is adaptation within the UNFCCC? And I thought of two kind of broad approaches that fits kind of with the ideas you talk about. One is the distributive element, and on one level, it's all the calls from the vulnerable and the least developed countries for funding for adaptation and efforts to adapt has to do with distribution. They want some kind of reparation for damage done to them. And I'm also quite interested in the relationship with the loss and damage, because how that got kind of, if I understood you correctly, kind of sidelined and left out of the adaptation track. I think that's an interesting story. But that's kind of one distributed element, the calls for reparation, for a transfer, often coupled with a kind of threat that if we don't get something in this respect, we might block the negotiations, might even block a final agreement. But there's also another distributive element, and has something I became very much aware in my dark past when I was working for the Danish Ministry of Finance from 2007 to 2010, where I interacted with a lot of other industrialized country finance ministries, also developing country finance ministries, but especially with industrialized country finance ministry officials. And there was a view among them, and also among foreign ministries or departments, that they didn't like spending money on adaptation finance. Mitigation finance was okay because it was a global public good to get something in return, but they accepted paying for adaptation finance because it was seen as a crucial side payment to the least developed countries. And also they were more willing to say, okay, we promise to give you this, but we might not provide all the stuff we have promised. And that's kind of the view, and I heard this many times, that adaptation is essentially when the unity equal to finance. I think that your other ideas kind of nicely underscore that it's not just about finance. It's about finance, but also about other things than just finance. And this is away from the distributive elements. It's more about how to do adaptation, and it's less conflictual because it's more about having, like, I wouldn't say best practice, but good practices to avoid conflict, but enhance synergies with other objectives. You mentioned biodiversity. I think you also mentioned indigenous people, gender issues, avoiding misadaptation, long-term planning. And I would also say that also within, even among industrialized country, foreign ministries, finance ministries, there is some attention to this, because there's awareness that they don't want to spend the money on something that on development projects that do not deliver because there's climate change. So adaptation is seen as important, but not so important within the negotiations. But that's less conflictual, I think, and I think that's a bit more about, I call it I couldn't find out a better term, but the how to do adaptation. And that kind of leads me into, I think my third comment is like the relationship to development aid, which you also brought up. And I think that it touches upon, as you said, additionality. There should be additional to existing development pledges, but there's also the argument should be mainstreamed. These are not inherently conflictual, as I think you also pointed out, but often the emphasis is diverging between contributor countries, NX1 countries, and the recipients of adaptation finance, that the contributors of adaptation finance tend to focus a lot more on mainstreaming, and that's not just the countries, but also the big multilateral development banks, whereas the recipients of adaptation finance are a bit more worried about this is being used as a kind of distraction, so that you don't talk so much about the additionality issue. And I think they're right. I mean, it is being used as kind of distraction. And that also leads me, and that's kind of a very basic question in a way, as a kind of implementation-oriented question or issue, is that adaptation is sometimes very difficult to identify in practice. What is adaptation? What is the adaptation component of something? Because in practice, it's carried out by development ministries within the countries, in many cases, and it's often involved development agencies from contributor countries or development banks, and often can be difficult to identify what the adaptation part of something that's already been planned, like a sewage system or agricultural project. What is the adaptation part of this? And that also leads to a very unfortunate dynamic where there's a sort of over-reporting of adaptation finance, and some of the contributor countries who are, as a kind of side effect of the targets for climate finance, have to show that they provide a lot of climate finance. They're very keen to inflate their climate finance contributions, and that's easier to do with adaptation than mitigation. So I mean, one example that actually Katrin Mikelova has is that they have a movie festival that's classified as adaptation finance. So you have a lot of stretching of what counts as adaptation. It leads perhaps to a kind of a question of, maybe it's not so relevant for the UNFC, but it's an important dimension to remember that often adaptation compared to what goes on within the UNFC and what goes on the ground can be two quite different things, and there can be both some positive and sometimes some negative interactions in this respect. I also would like to hear some more about your ideas on, or your perspectives on two different final issues, namely one in terms of ideas. What about the ideas that did not make it into the adaptation part, especially loss and damage, but also other more normative ideas that were left out? And also interests. I wonder a lot about migration, especially recently. How much does migration play a role? Because I could imagine that migration would be something that would give also some of the climate forcing countries a clear interest in enhancing adaptation in more vulnerable countries. So these were my reflections and questions, but yeah, I think it's a great presentation and something that's a really good starting point for further discussion.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I think just to take a couple of points ever so quickly, I mean, the point that adaptation was viewed as a side payment in some of the negotiations, I think is really, I've heard that too. And I think that it has been a long time coming to try and move the position on that. And so I think that's a great comment. And the other one is that, it's hard to know what adaptation really is. I spent some time on sabbatical at the World Bank where there was a discussion group about trying to measure adaptation. Everyone measures mitigation as, reduction in emissions, very easy, very straightforward. Adaptation, absolutely no way to measure it whatsoever, which is fascinating. Anyway, sorry, there's a little outside noise going on. I introduce now Jonas to the discussion and thank him for also joining us today, and just also encourage people, if they have questions, to submit them into the Q&A area in Zoom. And I'm sorry, one more housekeeping thing before I turn over to Jonas while I remember it, which is that on Thursday, the day after tomorrow, we will present another one of these fora, which will be on who pays for this. Can carbon pricing and Green New Deals be equitable solutions? So we look forward to having you join us for that at the same time, 1:30 Eastern time. And then on May 16th, we will have the final of these webinars where we will look at a couple of the hard cases for climate policy, Australia and Brazil. And that will be on May 16th. And given that we'll be joined by people from Australia and Brazil in wildly different time zones, that will be held from 3:30 to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So now I turn it over to Jonas, and I thank you for your patience.
All right, I just got kicked off Zoom for a second, so I hope this is working now and I'm back. But I really enjoyed reading this paper also as someone who doesn't work on adaptation. And so my comments and sort of my responses are really coming from this particular niche of looking at climate through the sense of sort of industry responses and sort of this idea that you can, at least on the mitigation side, combine kind of economic policy outcomes and climate objectives. And so I'm really sort of wondering to what degree this translates into the adaptation world as well. It was a pretty depressing paper, I thought, sort of, kind of an optimistic start. Okay, we're finally including this under the Paris Accords, but then lots of reasons why this inclusion is really sort of not full solution yet. The idea that adaptation is primarily about developing economies and it's sort of their problem to fix. The idea that solutions are so intensively local that we can't really develop a global solution, to me also is somewhat frustrating, even if maybe true. The idea that mainstreaming is sort of a way to climate-proof existing projects, but also then competes with specific projects that actually address adaptation sort of where it's needed most. And then this idea that we have this growing number of financial mechanisms in international institutions that address the financing needs, but they all, to me, have almost sort of a charitable character, right? And no one really has an interest in keeping them alive other than sort of some idea of wanting to help others. And it reminds me of kind of the climate discussions that were happening when I was an undergrad, 25 years ago, and we were thinking about the entire climate project sort of on these terms. And so that description of adaptation is sort of puzzling to me when compared to the trajectory we've gone through on the mitigation side, where climate really has become increasingly about economic interests and also about kind of strategic geopolitical ties and geopolitical power. And so this idea that mitigation policy is increasingly economic policy, it's policy for national competitiveness, it's a way for countries to project power and sort of create strategic linkages with others or control supply chains of critical goods that they can use then for other sort of purposes. And so this idea that economic ideas are increasingly pervading climate mitigation, because of industries like electric vehicles and wind and solar, that there's this interdependency in these supply chains that now are becoming a concern. Sort of where do we get critical minerals from? What power does China have in all of these industries, and how is the private sector involved? And so from that perspective, this view of adaptation raises, I think, two primary kind of notions here that I think I can't really see in the discussion, and I wonder kind of to what degree there might be a way to include them, or maybe this is a goal for the whole community to sort of work towards. And I think the first is, both of them relate to interests. I think it's sort of that particular point of your presentation and build on what Jacob was just talking about with his comments about migration. But so the first is really sort of to what degree can adaptation be a sphere of geopolitics and kind of strategic interests of states to try to help others and move beyond this voluntaristic kind of charitable engagement of the international system to one that's really about power politics, but actually then also maybe can motivate places to devote a different level of resources. And so currently we're primarily focused on this as a financing and kind of technology problem that rich countries can solve for poor countries in some ways. And so a lot of the debates are about how do you solve it for them while being inclusive, while taking their concerns into consideration. But it's a sort of, very hierarchical and somewhat awkward setup there. But there are also geopolitical interests at play, and must be to some degree, in how this plays out. And I don't think they're always good and positive, but they exist, and I wonder how they can be channeled in more productive ways. And so one example that I think I thought of a lot as I was reading this paper was the Belt and Road Initiative as a sort of imperfect Chinese approach to create export markets for domestic industries that doesn't have a particular climate sort of mission, but is in part used to fund adaptation projects in other parts of the world where China has geopolitical interests and wants to sort of, establish a foothold. And so one example of this would be China building adaptation infrastructure in the Maldives, for instance, where it's funding and building artificial islands that are higher above sea level than the natural islands there, and sort of essentially enabling this large-scale resettlement program that the Maldivian government has embarked on. And China is not doing that for charitable reasons, I think. It's doing this because it wants to have, a foothold in the region and maybe eventually build a naval base or whatever else might come from this. But it is devoting an enormous amount of resources to doing this. And so I wondered kind of how we can better account for these geopolitical and geostrategic interests in the adaptation space and maybe exploit them more productively to also actually solve adaptation problems. And then the second and related notion that sort of stems from this is really the role of the private sector and private sector interests, which also could then motivate states to do more across borders. And so this idea that adaptation is local really shuts out in many ways the possibility that there are financial interests that are better served by addressing this, both among those kind of likely to win as a result, so infrastructure sectors, industries providing resilience, and those likely to lose. And so I was thinking about what are the financial risks from non-adaptation that could motivate the private sector to become, better steward of these resources, be involved in a different way, and devote more financial resources to adaptation in all of the countries that the private sector is active in. And so from small scale investments in responding to urban heat waves to sort of these large scale infrastructure investments you cite in the paper, the building of new cities and migration. I mean, I'm just seeing lots of economic opportunity here for folks who know how to do these things. And so how do you, again, kind of take account of these private sector interests and build a framework for them so that they don't just exploit the low-hanging fruit and the best commercial opportunities, but sort of become a more productive force in total. And so I haven't really seen kind of a good depiction anywhere of when and how the private sector could do this beyond kind of discussion of private sector financing, I think is sort of at a very high level. And so that then I guess also raises the question of, where these private sector interests are sufficient to do this, when they don't add up to sufficient responses, and also when domestic private sector interests might be sufficient for national governments to be motivated to act across borders and help others sort of in the creation of export markets for some of these technologies. And so again, I think this links to the sort of BRI example of, governments very strategically helping to create markets by investing in these things or providing the financing for these things in other parts of the world. And so then it would become less of a sort of charitable intervention and more of a financial transactional one, but maybe one that could be replicated more or fill that financing gap that you outline in the paper. And so I guess that leaves me sort of with just a kind of broad reflection on Paris and sort of this move to nationally determined contribution as a sort of domestic turn really in climate policy making that prioritizes national goals and national capabilities and uses this kind of international shaming mechanism as its enforcement tool. And if we transfer this to adaptation, what it really lacks is a good mechanism that takes these domestic goals and motivates states to act across borders. And I think once things arrive at the border, we have this charitable sort of, we are doing this for the good of everyone in place. And I think that's different in the mitigation space, where there is something for us collectively. We have to decarbonize, and so involving others and investing across borders is a different game there, because we get something in return. But I haven't really quite seen that that logic sort of developed and applied in the adaptation space, and I think that could be really helpful for policymakers. But I also sort of wonder conceptually and intellectually to what degree that exists there, and we're just not seeing it or discussing it enough. And so I'll just leave it here. Thank you so much for a really interesting paper.
Thank you, Jonas. Those are great.
No, thank you. It's exciting to have someone who studies, mitigation and sort of the clean energy transitions and sort of incentivizing the rise, for example, of renewable energy sources to help focus also on the adaptation side, which is, as Jonas pointed out, probably a good deal different. So I guess what we can do now is open up for questions and answers. I guess maybe, Thomas, if you would like to respond to some of the comments and questions posed by the discussants, maybe after that, it will provoke people to ask some questions from the viewership.
All right, well, I will try to be provocative then. How's that? So thank you both for great comments and taking the time, no small amount of time, I'm sure, to read this paper, which arrived late on your doorstep. So I appreciate your willingness to undertake that. So I had a couple thoughts. So I thought Jacob's point about side payments is well taken. And it is something that occurred to me, but I haven't had time to track that down. And so one of the big puzzles here is that shift in the climate forcing states' positions on adaptation. It makes sense that it is a side payment in conjunction with or tied to loss and damage exemptions, perhaps, from adaptation in ways that remove the blockage to reach an agreement on mitigation side of the Paris Agreement. So it's definitely something I want to track down as I move forward. And I think it's a central component in thinking about this third element in terms of interests and how that shapes bargaining. Second, I think you're absolutely right about the kind of the conflation between development and adaptation, especially in practice as mainstreaming moves forward. And I think in the paper, I try to spend a little bit more time talking about additionality or additivity of adaptation money on top of existing commitments in development projects and programs. I didn't really get to speak much about it in the talk, but I think that's a critical issue, and it does seem an important way of obfuscating the accounting of global North support for adaptation in the global South in ways that are a little bit, questionable, I guess that. And then you raised questions about migration. Let me talk about that too in the context of speaking directly to a couple of Jonas's points. And I think you're absolutely right about interests and about thinking in terms of adaptation as a sphere of power politics or geopolitics. And how do we leverage the concerns about geostrategic vulnerabilities, geopolitical rivalries, as a way of encouraging more cross-border investment for adaptation projects. I wasn't aware of the Chinese project in the Maldives, so I'll take a look at that. I think that's really good. And I think that the question about migration is clearly an issue that arises in the adaptation space that has clear implications for political stability with cross-border spillovers. How much of that spillover kind of spills onto or laps up onto the shore of the great powers, I don't know, but it's certainly a direct interest of the major powers in thinking about how to manage that. The one thing that occurred to me as I have been doing the work on this paper, which really takes the kind of the UN focus, the UNFCCC focus, is that there seems to have been a concerted effort by the UNFCCC not really to speak much about moving cultures or communities or people even within borders, much less across borders. And so I'm wondering if this is a reflection of kind of a sovereignty norm in place that says we're going to help you do what you want, but you have to decide what you want. And once you figure that out, we'll help design and finance it. But we're really not going to get super heavily involved in encouraging you to move people and communities around. And we're certainly not going to encourage you to think about cross international border population movements. And so I don't know the answer to this, but I wonder if this isn't what has kept migration off of the I don't know, side of the practical implementation of adaptation within the context of the UNFCCC. I think that the state level bilateral financing for adaptation isn't as constrained. And so I would think that there are more efforts at the state level to think about the challenges to geopolitical position, the impact of migration and other climate change impacts, direct or indirect, on their strategic vulnerabilities. And so I'm wondering if the kinds of interests that you point to, which are really quite interesting and do parallel what one sees in the mitigation space, if one is more likely to see those if one drops down and looks less at the multilateral structure and more at the bilateral, kind of thinking about this as a foreign aid component rather than as a multilateral climate change regime. So I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure how much space I have to do that in the context of this paper, but it'd be kind of a really nice way to follow up on a paper such as this. So those are kind of my reactions to our responses to the comments.
Great, thanks, Thomas. Would any of the discussants, commentators like to respond or ask another question? We're getting a couple of questions, so I'll go into those in a minute, but if you guys would like a space, please take it. And that's my dog growling, not me, so I'm sorry. All right, let me go on then to some questions. You know, I might ask the first question, which is that Thomas, it's a really interesting paper, so thanks again. I think that on the migration issue, it may be that there's a reticence to acquiesce to defeat, which you talked about, say, with the Al Gore quote from 1992 and sort of the perceptions of adaptation. Now that's just moved, that line has moved further back in the sand, and now that line is at migration. I wonder if that's part of the issue, because interestingly, I had a group of students do a website about climate migration, and they refused to address the issue of official refugee status, which has sort of been negotiated and which some of the small island nation leadership wants, but others handily reject. I think probably in part for the same reasons, because they see it as a slippery slope. Once you define a legal status for people who, have to leave Tuvalu or the Maldives, then it's only a matter of time. I don't know if that's, I don't know, what kind of role do you think that kind of sort of climate fatalism may have in now the migration debate? I guess that's the question. And Jonas has a question too.
Do you want me to answer that one first?
How about if we collect a few and then come back? All right. All right. Thanks, Jonas.
I didn't have as much of a question as a comment sort of in response to your question. And my understanding is that under sort of international law, you can only really be a refugee if you're leaving something that's already happening. And so leaving ahead of time in response to something that's coming isn't really something that we've ever had to deal with. And so you don't really qualify for a lot of the sort of legal status that comes with being a refugee regularly. And so I think it sort of shows that the sort of international legal regime is also not really prepared in some ways to deal with this unique nature of this, where you're not leaving because of war or conflict at home, but you're sort of leaving because you know what the sea level rise is going to be in 10 years. And so I think that might be another sort of reason why we have this hesitation to deal with that, because I think legally it's just a complicated space as far as I understand.
Great. Okay. Jacob?
There's also a comment on migration. Also thinking of migration as something that provides a different set of actors with interests in terms of adaptation. So in Europe, and it might be different with the US, that's an increasing focus on the fear of climate migration from Africa, particularly. So that's something that could provide an incentive not to include migration in the UNFC negotiations, because I think there's a big worry about doing that and where that would lead to. But in terms of being more willing to provide, rather than being charitable or doing it as a side payment, so then actually providing an actual incentive for providing adaptation finance and supporting adaptation in least developed countries.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions I'd like to just raise. One is with regard to really some policies which can affect both mitigation and adaptation, such as nature-based solutions with adaptation co-benefits, right? That may be one example. And this questioner asks whether companies and governments have set concrete net zero targets that might require larger purchases of carbon offsets. If that's the case, then maybe, prioritization can be given to the kinds of policies and programs that have these kinds of co-benefits, and how much of an issue that has been as nations consider the mix of climate policies that they are undertaking domestically. So that's a question. There's another question actually which I sort of answered online, because it didn't seem as directly related to our topic, but I think maybe it is. It was about how Tempe, Arizona has started a car-free community by rebuilding from scratch. And so the formal question is about, whether we know of other places that are doing this. But I think the bigger question as it relates to this presentation would be, how do we bring all of this international discussion down to the local level? It seems really that, that was a question about sort of mitigation measures, right? About sort of dealing with automobile emissions. But I think the bigger question is, it seems that in general, the communication from the international level down to the local level is not that good. And that these, the policy that Jonas spoke of in the Paris Agreement of sort of making climate policy the building blocks domestic through the nationally determined contributions, and perhaps, as Thomas mentioned, through the NAPs and their descendants. How do we do a better job of sort of conveying the relevance of this for people on the ground, if you will, especially those in some of the most vulnerable areas who really seem to know the least about it? I don't know. Do you have any comments? Or maybe I'm editorializing. There's another question about how to reduce climate migration. It's a very broad question, but I guess it's certainly relevant to this discussion.
Okay, so there's a lot there. So let me do the global carbon markets for nature-based solutions with adaptation co-benefits. So under the Kyoto Protocol, there was a clean development mechanism, which I think took 2% of the funds raised from these offsets and dedicated those to the adaptation fund. So there's been some experience with that. I think given the degree to which carbon pricing mechanisms have failed to develop in great form at high reasonable prices, that remains a possibility for the future, but I don't think at the present it's something that's likely to generate a lot of finance for these purposes. So I think in potential, yes, in terms of where we are with carbon markets, probably not so much. In terms of the other things, don't accept defeat. So we have two things. One, we're going to adapt in place because we're afraid of migration, which I think is a powerful interest. You talk about Europe and being fearful of migration from North Africa and also from sub-Saharan Africa. I think in the US, we see that same fear here, even if it isn't expressed in that form. I think there's a lot of migration northward out of Central America that is increasingly seen to be climate related, and our efforts to stem that flow, I think we characterize it in economic terms, but I think there's a strong climate component to the push factor anyway. And I think the issue of migration is really complicated because they're really internal migration of coastal populations. So you think about Bangladesh and vulnerable people there compared to some of the small island developing states where the threat of inundation is really cataclysmic. And I think those are really distinct challenges that need to be handled through distinct processes. And it may well be that there's nothing you can do to prevent outward migration from some of the SIDS. But for larger continental-based countries who are facing internal migration, it makes sense to think about planning for where migrant flows are likely to locate, right? And so if you think about some of the instances, migrants flow into urban areas and place a lot of pressure on already struggling infrastructure. And so enhancing an infrastructure for a large urban area would not necessarily protect an existing population against a direct impact of climate, but will certainly have an impact 10 or 15 years down the road, indirectly supporting or making life better for refugee flows that are almost certain to happen. So I think there are things that can be done that acknowledge the fact that people will move to escape danger. People will move to try to diversify their income streams. And pretending that that is not going to happen and failing to plan to it seems to me deeply problematic, even if all we focus on is the internal migration part. And then how do you reduce migration? Which is, I guess, part of the same question. I think the challenge is to try to reduce involuntary migration. And so reduce the set of the population that is reluctant to move and heavily exposed or heavily vulnerable, but at the same time allow for voluntary migration in anticipation of and in response to more challenging conditions. I think you have to do a little bit of both moving forward. Yeah, so those are kind of my thoughts on that question. You're muted.
Todd, you're muted.
Still muted. Todd.
Sorry. Any other questions or comments? Thank you. I guess a final question is just sort of back to the big question, which is, does adaptation deserve to be considered co-equally with mitigation as a priority, or as a problem that we need to address immediately? And I guess the other part of it is, how do we, regardless of whether it's co-equal or subordinate to mitigation, how do we get more resources? Because as you said, and as Jacob's work has also demonstrated, I mean, there's a real lack of incentives to generate more more funds to say to adapt, and also the as you call it, the gap in scale is huge. What do we do?
So yes, I think it very much deserves to be on equal footing with mitigation, because it is the consequence, and I think increasingly the inevitable consequence of our emissions. How do we fund it? The optimistic part of me, so speaking to Jonas's point, would say it'd be nice if at the level of states, there'd be a greater willingness to allocate development assistance, other foreign aid programs, divert some money from military assistance programs to what we know are looming instabilities associated with climate impacts. My fear is that what we will see is kind of a response to crises. So there'll be natural disasters driving population movements, and we'll be responding to those piecemeal.
Great. All right, well, even if we didn't entirely solve the problem of adaptation today, at least we appreciate Thomas's help in presenting the paper, and to Jacob and Jonas also for helping us understand the problem better and help us move towards policy ideas and suggestions for what to do next. And I guess we'll see you hopefully on Thursday at 1:30. And just again, thank all of you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks a lot.